The wind moaned low through the pine ridge, swirling dry snow across the forest floor like ash from a long-dead fire. Luke Granger paused in his tracks, boots sunk deep into the powder, rifle slung over one shoulder. A few yards ahead, his dog had stopped moving. "Shadow?" he said softly. The German shepherd didn't answer. His muscles locked, one paw lifted mid-step. His head turned slightly, nostrils flaring. Then, without a sound, he bolted into the trees. Luke's pulse jumped. He followed, instincts honed from 2 decades in uniform kicking in. The Montana woods were familiar, but snow like this, silent, smothering, could hide anything. He pushed through the brush, eyes narrowed against the wind. 50 feet down a slight embankment, Shadow was already crouched low, ears perked, body tense like a spring coiled. Then Luke saw it. 2 men, sprawled on the snow like broken mannequins, uniforms soaked in blood. One lay still, face pale, chest rising in shallow, faltering breaths. The other, propped against a fallen log, turned his head slowly. "Don't call backup," he rasped. His lips were cracked, eyes glassy from the cold. "If they know we made it out, they'll come back." "Finish the job." Shadow gave a low, guttural whine and moved closer. He nudged the unconscious man with his snout, then gently pressed his body against the man's chest, curling to trap what little heat remained. Luke dropped to one knee beside them, heart hammering. Both wore deputy jackets, state-issued. But there was no patrol car in sight, no signs of a struggle, just blood, frostbite, and the silence of the mountains. "Jesus," Luke muttered. The conscious one was in bad shape. A deep gash cut across his thigh, blood now turning thick and black around the edges. The other, blonde, younger, had a bullet wound high on the shoulder. Luke checked for a pulse. Faint. But there. He stripped off his outer jacket and knelt beside the wounded officer. "I'm not calling anyone," he said, "but you're not dying here either." The man gave a weak nod and then passed out. Luke went to work, improvising a sled from the deer-hauling canvas strapped to his pack. Shadow didn't move from his post, his breathing steady, his eyes on the tree line like he expected something to come charging out of it. The way he stayed pressed against the deputy was deliberate, not just instinct, it was training. Luke had seen it before, back in Kandahar, when Shadow was still Army certified and saving more lives than most medics. As Luke lashed down the unconscious man, Shadow trotted a few feet away and began sniffing the snow, nose low. A moment later, he gave a low bark and began pawing at something half-buried beneath a drift. Luke walked over, a strip of torn black cloth. He pulled it free. Balaclava material. Not military issue. But what caught his eye was the faint symbol printed near one edge, barely visible. A snake wrapped around a vertical line. It wasn't a gang marking. It looked older, institutional. Shadow dropped back beside the wounded deputy and waited. The trek to the cabin took almost an hour. Luke pulled the sled through the snow, pausing only to catch his breath. Shadow ranged ahead, circling, watching. The trail was quiet. Too quiet. By the time they reached the small cabin tucked deep in the woods, both officers were near freezing. Luke kicked open the door, dragged them in, and laid the younger one, still unconscious, on the rug near the fireplace. The other groaned but didn't speak. Luke tossed more logs into the stove. The flames hissed as the cold melted off the 2 uniforms and pooled on the wood floor. Shadow stood guard near the door, growling every few minutes at the wind. As Luke cut away the bloody fabric from the younger officer's shoulder, he paused. A badge number stitched into the inside lining. Gaza, State Patrol. He turned to the other man, conscious again, but fading. "Who did this?" Luke asked. The deputy tried to speak, but only coughed. Then a whisper. Wallace. Luke stiffened. The name hit harder than he expected. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in almost a decade. Not since the day he was discharged and Shadow reassigned. Wallace had been the kind of officer who moved between agencies like a ghost, always behind the scenes, always too clean. Luke stared at the fireplace. The flames crackled softly. Then a sound outside. Shadow's ears shot up. He turned to the door, body stiff, nose pointed towards the trees. Luke moved slowly to the window and brushed the frost aside. At first, nothing. Then, movement. 2 shapes, just beyond the clearing, standing in the dark beneath the branches. Not hikers. Shadow growled low, a warning. Luke reached for the rifle he'd leaned against the door and stepped back. "We've got company," he said, "and I don't think they're here for coffee." Behind him, Shadow pressed closer to the injured man again, eyes never leaving the door. Luke's gut twisted. Whatever this was, it was bigger than 2 wounded officers, bigger than Wallace. And somehow his old war dog had sensed it first. Shadow hadn't just found survivors. He'd uncovered the start of something buried deep in snow and blood and silence. Something worth $1 million. And maybe, just maybe, worth dying for. The wood stove crackled to life, swallowing the cold in uneven gulps as Luke tossed another log inside. The small cabin, tucked deep in the Montana woods, had always been his retreat. Off-grid, out of reach, and far removed from the noise of the world. Now it smelled of blood, burned pine, and something Luke couldn't name yet, something heavier. He knelt beside the younger officer first. Garza. Pale, unconscious, his uniform damp and stiff with half-frozen blood. Luke worked in silence, cutting away the jacket and shirt to expose the gunshot wound along his shoulder. It had clotted, barely, but the chill had turned the skin a worrying shade of grey. The older deputy stirred, a soft groan escaping his lips. Luke turned toward him. "Name?" "Deputy Roy Fallon." He muttered, eyes squinting against the firelight. "State Narcotics Task Force. Luke Granger." Luke replied. "Retired. You're safe for now." Fallon's gaze drifted to the dog lying beside Garza. Shadow hadn't moved an inch since they arrived. His body was curled protectively against Garza's side, one ear twitching now and then, but otherwise still, watching, listening. "He hasn't left him," Fallon whispered, voice hoarse. "Since the snow." Luke nodded. That's how he was trained. Fallon winced as he tried to sit up, failing. "Where's your radio?" "No signal this far out," Luke said. "Even if there were, you told me not to use it." Fallon went quiet. Luke stood and crossed to the pile of gear they'd managed to bring in from the sled. He picked through the belts and utility pouches, checking for anything that could explain why 2 narcotics officers had been left for dead in the mountains. Then his fingers paused at a stitch on Garza's vest. It looked newer, different thread, not factory. Luke leaned closer, tracing it with a knuckle. Then carefully, he sliced the seam open with his pocket knife. Inside was a small black USB drive, wrapped in medical tape, tucked so deep it would have been missed in a field strip. He held it up. "Either of you want to explain this?" Fallon opened one eye, slow and deliberate. "We weren't just on a recon," he said. "We were tracking a controlled drop. It went sideways. This has video?" Luke asked. Fallon nodded once. "Video, audio, names. We didn't send it up the chain. Didn't trust it. Why?" Fallon stared at the ceiling for a moment, then met Luke's eyes. "There's a leak," he said quietly, "inside the State Bureau. Someone's tipping off every operation that gets too close." Luke didn't flinch. "How high?" Fallon hesitated, then said, almost too soft to hear, "Command level." Maybe higher, Luke slipped the USB into his old field satchel. He didn't say anything, but he felt Shadow's eyes on him, as if the dog understood the shift in the room. Gaza groaned. Shadow responded instantly, shifting his weight and nuzzling the man's jawline. Gaza's eyes blinked open. "You're okay," Luke said, crouching beside him. Gaza winced. "Where? Cabin. You're safe." Gaza's breathing stuttered, then steadied. Fallon coughed from the other side. "Tell him." Gaza blinked, unfocused. "They knew we were coming," he said. "We ran silent. No dispatch, no digital trail, but they were already there. Masked. Full tactical. They didn't just want the drugs gone," Luke leaned forward. "They wanted you gone." Gaza nodded slowly. "They called us by name." Before they shot, Shadow rose to his feet now, walked to Luke's side, and sat, his gaze fixed on the door. The tension in his shoulders told Luke everything. They were still being watched. Luke reached up and shut the cabin's inner latch. "You're telling me there's $1 million operation running through my backyard, and someone in uniform is making sure it stays hidden?" "Not just someone," Fallon said. "We think it's him." "Who?" Gaza's voice cracked. "Cole Wallace." Luke's blood chilled more than the snow ever could. He hadn't heard that name in years. Wallace had been a rising star once, military intelligence turned law enforcement, the kind of man who always seemed 1 step ahead of trouble and 5 steps ahead of everyone else. Luke had served under him. Once, it hadn't ended well. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the window panes like fingers tapping a warning. Luke glanced at Shadow. The dog had turned toward the far corner of the room, stiff, head tilted slightly. A sound. Luke grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Peering through the edge of frost, he spotted it. Barely. A figure in the tree line. Watching. Not moving. Another joined him. Both dressed in dark coats, faces hidden by hoods. "They're back," Luke said. Fallon tried to sit up. They came to finish the job. Shadow's growl was so low it vibrated through the floorboards. Luke looked down at him. "Think you can still do one more mission?" Shadow blinked, then turned toward the door, tail stiff, ready. Luke grabbed a coil of wire from a wall hook, along with 2 homemade snares he kept from hunting season. He tossed one to Shadow, who caught it in his teeth, and padded toward the rear exit, knowing exactly where to place it. The training hadn't faded. Not in either of them. Luke glanced at the men on the floor, then towards the door. If this was a war someone wanted, they'd just stepped into the wrong cabin. The fire had died down to a low orange pulse, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. The cabin, once a quiet haven in the Montana backwoods, now felt smaller. Every creak of the wind outside sounded closer. Every gust a possible footstep. And in the thick of it all, Shadow lay by the front door. Not asleep, not relaxed. Just still. Watching. Luke sat at the edge of the workbench, turning the USB drive over in his hand like it might speak. Fallon had dozed off again, propped up with pillows and a thick wool blanket, his breathing labored but steady. Gaza leaned against the wall near the window, his shoulder wrapped tightly in bandages, jaw clenched against the pain. Luke finally broke the silence. "Cole Wallace." Gaza turned slowly. "Yeah, that name means something to you?" Luke didn't answer right away. He stared into the dying fire for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter. "I knew him." A lifetime ago, Gaza didn't press, but his eyes narrowed. "In Iraq," Luke continued. "He wasn't the man handing out orders behind a desk. He was field side, intelligence, slick, sharp, always knew more than he should. He called it instinct, but most of us knew better. He had his own methods, his own rules." Gaza shifted. And he got 3 men killed on a mission we never should have been on. Their deaths were written off as a bad call by command. Wallace walked out with a commendation. I walked out with a discharge and 26 stitches in my back. Shadow's ears twitched. He's not just a dirty cop, Luke said. He's a technician. If he's running a network through this region, it's clean, controlled, and worse. He knows exactly how to hide it. Garza rubbed a hand over his face. We suspected someone big was blocking our stings. Wallace was only a rumor, a shadow name. No one dared put him in writing. But if this USB sticks him to that quarry site, even a whisper could be enough to pull a thread. Luke nodded slowly. And when that thread snaps, people like you end up bleeding in the snow. A low growl vibrated from Shadow. He rose to his feet without sound, shoulders low, tail stiff. Luke stood instantly, following the dog's gaze toward the far window. Talk to me, boy. Shadow moved to the door, nose flaring, then circled to the back hallway. Luke grabbed the rifle, silently flipping the safety off. Shadow was already crouched by the coat rack. Then Luke saw it. His paws were angled toward a particular spot in the floor, a shallow corner where 2 boards didn't quite align. Trapdoor, Luke muttered. He knelt, fingers feeling the seam, then pried it open. It was narrow, dark, and led to an old crawl space, probably built for storing food or fuel. But it was something else now. An escape route. Shadow sat back but didn't relax. His eyes stayed fixed on the back wall. Then a sharp crunch outside. Footsteps. Not the wind this time. Luke motioned Garza toward the hatch. You're moving. Now Garza didn't argue. He grimaced as he dropped down. Fallon was still out cold. Luke moved to the front window and parted the curtain by 1/2 inch. 2 silhouettes moved just outside the tree line. Not close enough to breach, but close enough to watch. Their postures were wrong. Too still. One lifted a pair of binoculars. Luke stepped back. Observation team. Shadow trotted back to his side. He didn't growl again, but his ears pinned flat and his body leaned forward, nose toward the air. They're scoping the place. Making sure you're dead, Luke said to no one in particular. They'll wait for night. Then move in, Garza's voice floated up from below. What's the plan? Luke reached into the gear closet and pulled out a steel chain spool and 2 homemade snares. The plan, he said, handing one to Shadow, who took it in his mouth without hesitation, is we make sure the snow remembers them, too. Shadow padded out the back entrance without making a sound. Luke watched him disappear into the trees, then followed in a wide arc, boots crunching just enough to alert the forest that something real was awake. Shadow didn't need instruction. He moved with the precision of a deployed soldier, eyes scanning, nose twitching. He doubled back twice before settling near a fallen tree that overlooked the cabin from the north. Luke set the snare near a narrow choke point between 2 pine trunks. Shadow buried it with his paws like he was born to do it. The snow covered the trap with a perfect blend of natural silence. They returned to the cabin just as the light began to fade. Inside, Garza had pulled himself halfway up the hatch again. His knuckles were white on the edge. Luke sat by the fire, reloading his rifle. We'll give them 1 warning. After that, we make it clear. You don't bleed 2 cops in my woods and walk away. Shadow lay down by the door once more. This time, he didn't blink. He knew the name Wallace meant something worse than betrayal. It meant unfinished war. The trap snapped with a steel clink muffled by snow, followed by a sharp, strangled grunt. Luke Granger didn't flinch. He stayed crouched behind the tree line, eyes narrowed, breath held. 30 yards ahead, one of the 2 shadows he'd seen earlier now writhed in the snow, one leg yanked sideways by a wire snare expertly buried hours earlier. The second figure darted forward to help. Rookie mistake. Shadow launched. The shepherd moved like a whisper across the drifts. No bark, no warning. He cut the second intruder off before the man could reach his partner, lips curled, teeth bared. He didn't lunge yet. He didn't have to. One look at those eyes, the sharp, intelligent glint, the perfect stillness, froze the man in place. Luke emerged from the trees, rifle at low ready, voice cold. "Unless you want a matching limp, I'd suggest you drop whatever's in your coat." The man didn't speak, but slowly raised his hands. No gun in sight. But his coat was too thick. Could have been hiding a dozen things. Luke stepped closer. "Who sent you?" The man glanced toward his trapped partner, who was cursing and clawing at the snow, trying to loosen the cable digging into his thigh. Luke aimed low, fired once. A bark of pain from the wire, just close enough to get attention, not hit flesh. Shadow didn't move. His growl deepened. "I said who sent you. We were just scouting," the man said, voice young, not local. "Told to look for movement. Cabin in the ridge. That's all we knew." Luke nodded, slowly. So they don't know who's inside. Yet the kid's silence was answer enough. Luke stepped around and yanked the first man free of the snare. He was bleeding, limping hard, but alive. "You walk south, through the clearing. You don't stop. If I see either of you again, I won't ask questions." The injured one snarled. "You don't know who you're screwing with." "I do," Luke said. "That's why I'm still standing." Shadow circled them once, then returned to Luke's side, his eyes never leaving the woods. The two disappeared downhill into the dusk. Luke waited until their outlines were gone, then turned to Shadow. "Let's see where they came from." The shepherd led. He moved fast now, energized, reading the ground like a map. They cut through a dry patch of woods into a gully that ran northward along the frozen creek bed. It had been still for weeks, no melt, no movement, but Shadow caught something beneath the snow. He stopped, pawed once, then twice. Luke joined him, brushing aside a thick pile of drift. Plastic, black, half-melted packaging, and the chemical stench hit like a slap. Luke knelt closer. There were syringes, burned tape, crumpled blister packs. This wasn't trash. It was evidence. He kept digging. 2 feet down, hidden beneath a snapped pine bough, was a tarp-wrapped bundle with heat-sealed corners, marked with a crude emblem, a snake wrapped around a staff. The same symbol from the fabric Shadow found the night they rescued Fallon and Gaza. Next to the bundle lay something that made Luke's heart stop for a beat. A Glock 22. Standard issue. The grip was covered in black tape, probably to obscure prints, but the serial number was intact. Luke wiped the side with a gloved thumb. MC04191. His breath caught. That prefix, MC, Milford County, his old precinct. He hadn't seen that tag in years. And the badge number belonged to Officer David Franks. A good man. Quiet. Straight arrow. Went on leave 6 months ago, disappeared. The department said he'd transferred out, but no one ever said where. Luke holstered the gun, carefully. Then Shadow stiffened again. Another sound. Not human. Luke followed the dog's stare across the frozen creek, where fresh tracks, boot prints, no animal, headed into the trees. Too clean, too deliberate. Someone had been here. Watching the drop, or watching who would come for it. Luke stepped back and scanned the perimeter. The forest was dense here, the kind of terrain that worked better for ghosts than hunters. He whispered, "Let's move." Shadow trotted ahead, silent and focused, navigating the terrain with the precision of years-long trust. They looped back toward the cabin through a longer route, taking care not to cross their earlier trail. By the time they returned, night had fallen. Fallon was awake and upright now, hunched near the fire with a blanket over his legs. Gaza stirred at the sound of boots on wood. Luke dropped the Glock on the table. Both men froze. "Where'd you get that?" Gaza asked. "Frozen Creek bed." Near what looks like a transfer site, Fallon reached for the pistol with his good hand, stared at the engraving. "Frank's," he whispered. "He was our contact." Luke stared. "He's dead?" "No," Fallon said, voice rough. "At least, he wasn't supposed to be. He was helping us track the Northern Line. Went off-grid. We thought he'd been burned." Gaza looked at the weapon. "If they left this out there, they're either sending a message or they're cleaning up." Luke shook his head. "That wasn't clean." That was rushed. He stepped toward the fire, tossing another log into the coals. "They're sloppy now, which means they're nervous." He turned to Shadow, who had laid down beside the table but hadn't stopped watching the door. And that's when Luke realized the game had flipped. They weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted, and Shadow had known it long before any of them. Snow dusted the treetops in soft spirals as Luke and Shadow moved through the lower valley, their breath steaming in the sharp morning air. The frozen creek still whispered under its crust of ice, winding like a silver thread through the pines. Shadow's paws padded silently over the snow, nose twitching, body low, alert in a way Luke hadn't seen in days. Something was off. They were tracking old footprints, boots mostly, but Shadow kept veering away from the human scent, circling, doubling back. Luke let him lead. The shepherd wasn't guessing. Then the dog froze. He turned sharply, nose to the ground, and let out a soft, clipped whine. Luke stepped closer and crouched. There, pressed faintly into the snow, paw prints. But not Shadow's. The shape was unmistakable. Shepherd, possibly Malinois, working breed. But the gait was wrong. The prints staggered. The rear right foot dragged slightly, leaving a small furrow every 3 steps. Injury. Shadow nosed the prints, then looked up at Luke, ears pinned back. Not fear, but confusion. Then something else. Recognition. Luke's voice dropped. "Someone used another K9 out here." Shadow began following the trail without needing instruction. The prints led west toward the quarry road, but then veered into a steep ridge where the trees thickened. The dog picked up speed, his breathing steady. Luke jogged behind, boots crunching frozen needles, heart pounding. 10 minutes later, they found it. A rusted-out storage shed, long forgotten, pressed into the side of a slope and almost hidden by frost-bitten brush. The lock on the door had been snapped, then awkwardly looped back through the latch. Someone had made it look sealed from the outside. Luke raised his rifle and nodded. Shadow crouched low, waiting. He kicked the door in. It creaked open into stale darkness. The air smelled of mildew, plastic, and faintly chemicals. Luke swept the flashlight across the room. Overturned crates, a broken table, zip ties on the floor, a tarp folded in the corner. Shadow bolted toward the back of the room and let out a bark, not loud but sharp, pointed. Luke followed. Behind a half-collapsed shelving unit, partially obscured beneath a crumpled army poncho, sat a duffel bag. Shadow nudged it once, then backed off, whining low. Luke dropped to his knees and opened the zipper. Inside, the contents gleamed beneath the beam of his flashlight. Sealed vacuum packs, at least a dozen, each marked only with a coiled black snake and a printed number, 16. Luke didn't need a lab test. He knew the look, the weight, the setup. This wasn't heroin. It was something far worse. Fentanyl. He pulled one pack halfway out, then spotted the folded sheet tucked beside it. A map. It was creased and weather-worn, marked with red ink and a line of coordinates. At the bottom, a handwritten scrawl, Site C3, December 18th, 3 days from now. Luke's gut clenched. That wasn't just a supply point. It was a deadline. Shadow circled the room, nose working frantically, then stopped at a darker patch along the far wall. Luke followed. A smear of dried blood. Low to the ground. Beside it, another paw print. This one streaked. Shaky. Shadow sniffed again, then looked back at Luke, eyes filled with something that read almost like mourning. Luke whispered, "They left it behind, didn't they? A trained dog. Wounded. Used for transport or tracking, maybe both, but expendable. Not every team honored their K9’s the way the military had taught Luke to." Shadow backed away from the blood, head low. He stood at the door again, as if done with the place. Luke zipped the duffel shut, grabbed the map, and gave one last scan of the shed. No cameras, no movement. But the feeling lingered. Whoever ran this op had been here recently, and sloppily. They didn't expect anyone to find this site. Outside, Shadow moved faster now, ears up, tail alert. They were exposed. Luke knew better than to stick around. By the time they reached the edge of the ridge, the sun had dropped low behind the peaks. Long shadows dragged across the snow. Luke paused and glanced back at the shed. Somewhere there was another dog, hurt, maybe dying, left behind in the cold by men who used it like a tool. Shadow came to his side and sat. Luke knelt and scratched behind the shepherd's ears. "We won't let that happen to you," he murmured. "Not now." Not ever. Shadow leaned into the touch, but didn't stay long. His eyes were locked on the path ahead. They were moving again. Not just running from the truth anymore, they were heading straight toward it. Snow hammered down in sheets as Luke pushed through the brush, Shadow close at his side, Gaza and Fallon struggling behind him. The earlier snowfall had turned into a punishing storm, wind slapping like ice razors. Trees creaked overhead, and every step through the ridge felt heavier than the last. They were being hunted again. Luke didn't need to hear gunfire to know it. He could feel the pressure in the silence. Whoever Wallace had sent, they were getting smarter. No headlights this time. No boots crunching too close. Just the cold and the quiet that always comes before something breaks. Shadow suddenly stopped. He turned toward a trail that barely existed anymore, grown over by pine saplings and wind-felled limbs. But Luke recognized the split in the rock face just beyond. The ranger station. He grabbed Fallon by the elbow and pulled him forward. "We go now. That's shelter. Could be a mile, could be less. But if we don't move, we freeze." Gaza nodded, jaw clenched tight as he helped Fallon keep pace. Shadow led them without hesitation. He knew the terrain better than anyone. It wasn't just memory. It was something older, wired deep into him. Purpose. They reached the building just as dusk collapsed. The ranger station had been out of service for at least a decade. The roof was partially caved in on the north end, and vines had long since claimed the outer walls. But the front door still stood, barely hanging from rusted hinges. Luke raised his rifle and signaled for the others to wait behind. Shadow moved first, slipping through the broken doorframe like a ghost. A second later, a low bark echoed from inside. Not sharp, not urgent. Clear. Luke ushered Gaza and Fallon through, then stepped inside last. The interior smelled of pine dust and old paper. A map wall had collapsed onto the floor, covered in snow blown in through cracked windows. An old desk sat at the far end, buried under years of rot, and behind it stood a figure, tall, backlit by the fading light from a broken window. She raised her sidearm in a flash. "Move again, I shoot." Luke didn't move, but Shadow did. The dog froze mid-step, then tilted his head, ears twitching. One slow step forward, then another. The woman's eyes locked onto him, and widened. "Shadow," she breathed, Her hand shook, the gun lowered. Shadow crossed the room slowly, like he was stepping into a memory, and pressed his head gently into the woman's thigh. She dropped to her knees, eyes wide with disbelief. "No," she whispered. You're supposed to be gone." Luke lowered his rifle. Madison Reeve. It had been years, but he hadn't forgotten that voice. Calm, precise, and always edged with quiet pain. She wrapped her arms around the dog, burying her face into his coat. "You disappeared." "That fire in Arizona. We searched for days." Luke stepped closer. "They listed him KIA. They never found a body." Madison stood slowly, brushing snow from her green tactical jacket. The faded FBI patch on her shoulder barely clung to the stitching. "Because someone wanted him written off?" she said. Garza leaned against the wall. "You're FBI." "Was," she said. "Still am, technically." "But I've been off-book for almost 2 years." Luke looked at her closely. She'd changed. Her features sharper, hair shorter, the quiet calculation in her eyes heavier than before. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. She nodded to the radio behind the desk. "Intercepted a signal 3 nights ago. Someone used an encrypted military channel, one that shouldn't exist anymore." "That was me," Luke said. "Old field unit." "We found a drive." Her expression shifted. "From Wallace's operation?" Luke nodded. "He's deeper in this than any of us thought." Madison walked toward the map wall, now crumbling under its own weight. She stepped over it carefully and pulled a duffel from under the desk. Shadow followed her like a soldier reporting back to command. She unzipped the bag, pulled out a laptop, and powered it on with a backup battery. "I've been tracking Wallace for years," she said, "but every time I got close, something would go sideways. My team would get pulled. Evidence lost. Case collapsed. I started asking questions. Then one of my own tried to kill me." Luke glanced at Shadow, who now sat at Madison's heel, eyes locked forward, alert but calm. "He's been looking for you," Luke said. Madison swallowed hard. "He remembers." There was a long pause. Fallon broke it. "We found a fentanyl cache in a ridge shack 3 miles west, hidden in a duffel. Snake insignia. Shipment set for Site C3 on December 18th. Madison didn't blink. "That's the handoff site." "How do you know?" She tapped the laptop. "Because it's on this drive. Same drop code, same date, but this version came from a separate source." Someone inside Garza shifted. "You have a leak inside your agency too?" She looked up. "You think Wallace is just sitting inside state operations? Number, he has clearance at the federal level. The man doesn't run drug deals. He runs people, scared, bought, or buried." Luke watched her, quiet for a moment. "You trust anyone left?" She looked down at Shadow. "I trust him." Shadow stood now, moving toward the fire pit in the center of the room, sniffed once, then curled into a ball, always facing the door. Outside, wind howled through the trees. Luke crossed the room, picked up a broken chair, and began feeding it into the pit. "If Site C3 is real, we hit it." Madison nodded. "I have one secure contact left. A federal judge, off-grid, no servers, no leaks. If we can get footage, if we can get Wallace in frame, speaking, acting, it's enough." Garza leaned back against the wall. "Then we've got 3 days." Luke sat beside Shadow, who lifted his head and rested it on Luke's boot. "You're back in the fight, huh, partner?" Shadow thumped his tail once. And for the first time in days, the room felt like more than a place to hide. It felt like a starting line. The storm outside raged, but inside, war dogs were gathering. The snow had slowed to a hush by the time they returned to the cabin, but the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like something holding its breath. Luke entered first, rifle raised, clearing each room the same way he used to clear mud homes in Kandahar. Quick, efficient, and with a gut-deep tension he couldn't shake. Shadow slipped past him, silent as smoke, nose twitching, head on a swivel. Madison followed, sidearm ready. The cabin looked untouched at first. Same burned-out logs in the hearth, same blankets tossed where Fallon had slept. But Shadow froze by the corner of the living room, ears stiff, eyes fixed on the far wall. Luke stepped to his side. "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't move. He stared at the wall-mounted smoke detector. Not the kind Luke had installed. Madison was already moving. She reached up and twisted the cover. It popped off with a soft click. Inside, hidden behind the molded plastic, was a tiny pinhole camera. Live. Still recording. Jesus. Luke muttered. Madison pulled it free and dropped it into a mylar pouch from her vest. Whoever planted that knew you'd come back. Shadow circled the floorboards beneath the hearth, then scratched at a loose plank, one Luke had always meant to repair. His claws scraped wood twice before the edge popped up. Underneath lay a sealed plastic pouch. Inside was a folded map and a burner phone. Luke stared down at it. Madison crouched beside him, gloved hands flipping the pouch open. The map was nearly identical to the one found near the fentanyl stash, except this one had additional markings in red. Circles, numbers, dated lines connecting drop zones. The phone powered on. One missed call, no number, just a timestamp from 2 nights ago. Luke backed away. He was here. "Wallace?" Madison asked. He planted that. Personally, he wanted this scene, wanted us to find it. She looked at the map again. It's a message. A challenge. Luke pointed at the boldest mark. Site C3, December 18th. Madison stood slowly, face pale but set like stone. That's 2 days from now. Garza leaned against the doorframe, watching quietly. He wants to bait you out. He thinks we'll show up desperate. Madison's eyes locked on his. Then we do. Luke's jaw clenched. We walk right into his crosshairs? No, she said. We walk into his mistake. She moved to the kitchen table and laid everything out. Both maps, the phone, the 2 USBs, the photos from the creek bed, the shell casing Luke had recovered with the department's serial number still etched on the brass. This is enough, she said. To indict him? Maybe, but it's not enough to bury him. Not for good. Luke exhaled slowly. So we film it. She nodded. We catch him at the drop, hands on the product, giving orders. Everything recorded on multiple channels. Audio, video, time-stamped Garza crossed the room. Even if we get that, who do we give it to? Wallace has people at every level. I have 1 judge left. Madison said. Retired, off-book. Doesn't owe Wallace a thing. I've already made contact. Luke walked to the window. Snow drifted softly against the pane. He watched it pile up on the edge of the porch where Shadow now stood, body still, ears up. Luke knew that posture. It was how soldiers waited before a raid. It was how a dog remembered every command ever given, even after years in the dark. Then we go, he said. Madison nodded. Tomorrow we prep. Then we... Strike Shadow gave a soft growl at the door. Luke didn't look away from the trees. He knows, he said quietly. Madison joined him. Let him. The ghosts he made are walking again, and this time they were bringing the storm with them. The sun had barely crested the ridge when the team took position. The old mining site sat nestled in a crumbling gulch at the edge of Bear Ridge, its rusted equipment and weather-stained shacks long abandoned to snow and silence. But today, it breathed with quiet tension. Luke crouched low behind a pile of collapsed rails, eyes scanning the open yard through a pair of field glasses. Beside him, Shadow stayed prone, tail flat, ears twitching at every gust of wind. The K9 vest he wore was snug and clean, freshly stitched with a single tag, Shadow Unit. Across the clearing, Madison knelt beneath a broken conveyor tower, her voice calm in Luke's earpiece. Surveillance in place. Recorder live. No visual on Wallace, yet Garza and Fallon were farther downslope, hiding near the equipment shed. Both carried short-range mics and wore body cams feeding into Madison's encrypted recorder. Luke checked his watch. 8:12 a.m. 3 minutes past the agreed time. Then the sound came. Low and deliberate. Tires grinding gravel. The SUV rolled into view like a ghost from the past. Black, window-tinted, engine humming low. It stopped near the center of the yard. 4 men stepped out. Luke adjusted his scope. First, 2 with tactical jackets and mirrored sunglasses. Typical muscle. One of them carried a reinforced briefcase. The third man looked younger, civilian clothes, glancing around nervously. Courier. And then came the fourth. Cole Wallace. He stepped out like he owned the dirt beneath him. Grey overcoat, black gloves, a slight limp in his left leg, but no hesitation. He moved with the smooth arrogance of a man who'd outlived consequences. Luke's chest tightened. It had been years, but the man hadn't changed. That same calculating stare, that same smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Madison's voice came through the comm. Target confirmed. Wallace on site. Cameras rolling. Luke whispered into his mic. Hold positions. Wait for engagement trigger. Wallace approached the courier. The briefcase exchanged hands. Luke zoomed in. One of the enforcers was scanning the perimeter with a monocular. Madison, 10 feet away from him, didn't move. Her breathing remained even, her sidearm tucked just out of sight beneath her coat. Then Shadow lifted his head. His ears snapped forward. Body tense. Luke looked at him. What is it, boy? Shadow didn't respond with a bark. He turned his head to the ridgeline above them, nostrils flaring. Then his body coiled. Luke followed his gaze, and saw it. A shimmer in the snow, just at the edge of a rock outcropping. Glass. The faintest glint of a rifle scope. Sniper. And it was pointed directly at Madison. Shadow moved before Luke could stop him, launched up the ridge. Pause, slicing through the snow, a silent missile of muscle and memory. The sniper never saw him coming. By the time the man turned, Shadow was already airborne. He hit with full force, knocking the shooter backward. A single muffled shot discharged into the air as the rifle flew from the man's hands. Below, chaos erupted. Wallace shouted, spinning toward the SUV. One of his men reached for a weapon. Madison drew and fired once into the air. Federal agents, drop it! The 2 enforcers hesitated. One lowered his weapon, the other didn't. Garza and Fallon emerged from cover. Luke sprinted towards the scene, rifle up. Wallace ran. He bolted toward the tree line, the briefcase still clutched in one hand. Luke cursed and followed. Shadow reappeared, coat dusted with snow, panting hard but uninjured. Madison pointed toward the woods. He's cutting east. Luke didn't hesitate. He and Shadow gave chase, tracking Wallace's prints through the snow. They caught him just past the creek bed. Wallace was slowed by his limp, stumbling through a patch of brush. Luke raised his rifle. Don't. Wallace froze. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing. You don't have the authority. Luke stepped closer, Shadow at his side. We have everything else. Wallace looked at the dog, then back at Luke. I thought they'd decommissioned him. Luke's voice was like stone. You tried to burn him alive. Wallace's mouth twitched. Loyalty, he said, always gets in the way of profit. Shadow growled. Madison's voice came through Luke's earpiece. All footage secured. Audio clean. We got it all. Luke stepped forward and wrenched the briefcase from Wallace's hand. Shadow circled behind, teeth bared. Wallace lifted both hands in mock surrender. "You've made your move," he said. "Now let's see if it sticks." Luke didn't respond. Back at the yard, federal backup had arrived, 2 unmarked Suburbans climbing the ridge trail. The site was secured. Wallace's men were cuffed and searched. The courier turned out to be an undercover agent Wallace had never suspected. His voice, captured clearly on the body cam, described every deal, every payout, every threat. Madison stood near the old rail beam, watching Wallace get stuffed into the back of a federal truck. Luke approached her. Shadow walked beside him, tail still high. Madison looked down at the dog. "You saved my life today." Luke nodded. He never stopped working. "We just stopped listening." Shadow leaned into Madison's leg, gently. And for the first time in 5 years, she smiled. A real one. The sting had worked, but something told all of them it wasn't over yet. The federal courtroom in Denver was packed, press rows crammed, phones held low but recording, a silent current of tension running beneath the polished oak benches and marble columns. The air carried the sterile chill of justice, but beneath it lay something raw. Heavier Luke sat in the second row, just behind the prosecution table. He wore a simple blazer, clean shave, no tie. Shadow lay at his feet, head resting between his paws, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. But his eyes always stayed open. They called Madison first. She stepped up, steady and crisp in her navy suit. A far cry from the mud-covered agent who had crouched beneath rusted beams days ago, but the same resolve lit her voice as she testified. Cole Wallace orchestrated a network of illegal drops across protected federal land. He manipulated logistics contracts, exploited fire cover zones, and used encrypted drop phones to relay movement. We intercepted one of those phones, buried beneath a false floor at an abandoned cabin. It held locations, times, and names. She paused. And if it weren't for Shadow, we wouldn't have found it in time. A few heads turned toward the dog in quiet respect. Later, Luke was called. He stood tall, heart pounding but words clean. "I wasn't supposed to be involved. I came to scatter ashes. I left with a mission. The man who burned my brother's partner alive was still operating. I couldn't walk away again." The defense tried to poke holes. How can a civilian's testimony be trusted over an agent's? But Madison stood again. The evidence wasn't just verbal. It was video, audio, GPS logs, and forensic traces, all corroborated. The defense attorney, slick-haired and venom-tongued, gestured toward Shadow. "And the dog? Are we to believe this animal is a credible link in this chain of justice?" That's when Luke leaned forward. "He's not a witness. He's a survivor." The room stilled. He was burned alive because Wallace ordered a cover-up. He clawed his way out of that fire. Then 5 years later, he identified the scent on a burner phone. He led us to the sniper. He saved more lives than most of us sitting in this room. The judge didn't interrupt. He let the silence do the work. By the end of the third day, the jury didn't need long. Unanimous on all charges: racketeering, conspiracy to commit federal land crimes, obstruction of justice, attempted murder of a federal agent. Cole Wallace didn't flinch as the verdict was read. But Luke caught the tiniest twitch at the corner of his mouth when Madison rose from her seat, walked toward the railing, and rested a single hand on Shadow's head. That moment spoke louder than any sentence ever could. Outside, snow flurried against the courthouse steps. Reporters swarmed, but Luke kept walking. Madison matched his pace. "Shadow did more than track evidence," she said quietly. "He reminded us what loyalty looks like." Luke gave a slight smile, and he still has more to give. They reached her government SUV. She opened the passenger door, then paused. "We're rebuilding the K9 volunteer unit. You were right. It shouldn't have been shut down. Luke raised an eyebrow. We? Madison nodded. We're calling it Shadow Unit, and I want you to lead training. Luke looked down. Shadow had already jumped into the back seat, tail wagging faintly, as if he understood. He exhaled. Yeah, all right. 1 week later, they stood on the outskirts of a snow-dusted training compound in Fort Collins, an old ranger station turned makeshift K9 center. 4 new dogs had already arrived. Rescues, washed-outs, retirees with something left in the tank. And a handful of young volunteers, quiet and eager, listened as Luke knelt beside Shadow and began the first lesson. Trust isn't given, he told them. It's earned. But once you have it, you fight for it with everything you've got. Shadow barked once, sharp and clear, tail thumping twice against the frozen dirt. Madison leaned against the doorframe of the station, arms crossed, watching them with a rare softness in her eyes. The unit had a name now, and a heartbeat, and for the first time in years, Luke felt like he wasn't just fighting ghosts. He was building something they'd all be proud of. The wind rolled down from the ridge, slow and cold, brushing past the old pine trees and whispering through the grass around the cabin. The firewood pile out back had been restacked. The porch had a fresh coat of stain. But the soul of the place, quiet, watchful, steady, was still right where it had always been. Shadow lay beneath the edge of the porch, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded, his silvered muzzle rising with each breath. The scar across his flank was barely visible now under his thick coat, but those who knew him didn't need to see it. The legacy wasn't in the mark. It was in the silence, the stillness, the loyalty that had outlived fire and betrayal. Above him, nailed to the timber beam of the porch, hung a new wooden plaque. The carving was simple, done by hand, the edges rough from a blade that had hesitated once too often. But the words cut clear. Here, truth was defended by fur and loyalty. Madison stood by the edge of the clearing, arms folded. She wore jeans and a flannel, not a badge in sight. She'd been up since dawn reviewing intake reports from the newly reopened Shadow Unit. They were 3 dogs strong already, and more applications were coming in each day. Luke approached from the truck, holding 2 cups of black coffee. He handed one to her without a word. They stood in silence for a beat, watching as a young woman in uniform, one of the new trainees, worked a sit-stay command with a nervous Belgian Malinois by the barn. She reminds me of me, Madison said quietly. Luke took a sip. The handler or the dog? A faint smile crossed her face. Both. Down by the porch, Shadow lifted his head just enough to survey the field. His gaze tracked the Malinois, then the handler. His tail thumped once against the wood. Barely a sound, but enough. Luke noticed. He approves. He's earned that right. The training grounds had been built using what was left of Wallace's seized assets. Poetic justice, Madison had called it. The land that once hosted corruption now raised guardians. Every new unit carried Shadow's insignia stitched on their gear, a silhouette of a German shepherd mid-sprint, flanked by pine trees. No names, no dates, just presence. Inside the cabin, the living room had become a briefing space. Maps pinned on the wall, a corkboard of old cases, faded photos, newer ones pinned beside them. A timeline of redemption. There was one photo in the center of it all, Luke's brother and his K9 partner, both in desert gear, grinning into the wind. Shadow's old ID tag hung from the tack below it, blackened and bent, but still legible. Luke stepped inside and adjusted the frame, just slightly. I don't think he would have believed we'd come back here, he murmured. Madison joined him. No, but I think he would have hoped it. Outside, one of the new dogs barked, short, eager, the kind that meant "look at me" more than "danger." But it echoed across the hills like something older, like memory. Shadow stirred again. This time, he rose. His limbs were slower now, not as sure, but his steps had purpose. He padded down into the clearing, stood beside the young Malinois, and looked her square in the eye. The dog froze, then sat automatically. Her handler gasped. Shadow turned and walked back to the porch without fanfare, flopping back into his spot like nothing had happened. But Luke and Madison had seen it. "That," Luke said, "was the best damn training demo I've ever witnessed." Madison didn't reply. She was watching Shadow with something close to reverence. They knew the time would come, when he wouldn't walk that hill again, when his bark would go quiet for good. But for now, he still had lessons to teach. Still had that presence, that quiet instinct, that edge honed by fire and loyalty. And more than anything, he had started something. The recruits called it the bark, the moment when Shadow first broke silence and led Luke back into the world, the moment that changed everything. Because sometimes it's not the roar that sparks change, it's the single bark that refuses to be ignored. Out by the sign, Madison brushed her fingers over the carved words. Luke stood beside her, arms folded. "We should make it official," she said. Luke arched a brow. Official? The program. The stories. The message. People need to hear it. What these dogs do. What they give. Luke looked at the field. Handlers and hounds training under the same sky that had once held smoke and gunfire. He nodded. And so it began again. From the cabin that once held shadows, a light started to spread. And as the screen slowly faded to black, a final question echoed, steady and warm. What's your story with a loyal pet? If you believe in what Shadow stood for, loyalty, courage, and the second chances we often don't think we deserve, help us keep his story alive. Subscribe to the German Shepherd channel for more true stories of canine heroes, untold missions, and the bonds that never break. Because sometimes the smallest bark is the one that changes everything.